Everybody gets settled. I just wanted to make a suggestion. People in the hallway and over coffee have been talking about the fact that might be a little strange if we have this whole conference on what we can do and not talk about what we can actually perhaps do today about what's going on. So I was going to suggest, we have an hour and a half for lunch. Let's come back after an hour here and just have an informal conversation. I know we have question cards, so not everybody can talk. Let's just have a conversation. I don't know what time we're supposed to come back, a half hour before we're supposed to come back. So let's take an hour for lunch and then come back and plot. Come back at 2:30.
Welcome back, everybody. That was a very inspiring and powerful first panel we had this morning, so thank you to all of our morning panelists. My name is Ngai. I teach history here at Columbia, and I have the pleasure and honor to moderate this second panel on crossing borders, refugees, migrants, stateless lives. And as I'm sure everybody here knows, this is a burning question in our own time, one that is extremely controversial in American domestic politics, and we're watching before us the unfolding of a really terrible regime of repression and removal and refusal of immigrants and refugees. So I really look forward to our panelists. I will introduce them together, and as in the first panel, I will not go into the details of their biographies, which you can find in your programs, and I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. Our first speaker is Diana Taylor, who is university professor and professor of performance studies in Spanish at New York University. To her left is Lyndsey Stonebridge, a professor of humanities and human rights at the University of Birmingham in Great Britain. Next, we have Debarati Sanyal, professor of French at the University of California, Berkeley. And last but certainly not least, we have Juan Carlos Ruiz, who is the 6th Lutheran pastor at Good Shepherd in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and an ordained Catholic priest. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and Professor Taylor, we will start with you. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for this invitation, and I want to extend my warmest congratulations to the Center for the Study of Social Difference for its 10 years of existence. It's a very wonderful thing to be able to celebrate today. I'm going to start with a video in response. Okay, so this is in response to the question of what we can do when there is nothing to be done, and doing nothing is not an option. I will speak about Las Patronas, who I interviewed. I'm going to turn this off if I can. Maybe somebody can help me turn this off. I'm not sure if I'm not messing everybody's thing up. Okay. Las Patronas, who I interviewed in August 2017 as part of Hemi's ongoing initiative, Ecologies of Migrant Care. You saw the train La Bestia that goes from the southern part of Mexico up to the US-Mexico border. And it's infamous because it's been a vehicle by which many migrants from Central America make that very torturous trek from Mexico's southern border to its northern border. I don't know how much you know about it, but 200,000 migrants have been killed doing that trek since 2006. So Las Patronas, they live in this little tiny town right on the edge of the tracks. In February 1995, Leonila Vasquez asked her daughters Norma, who you saw in the video, and Bernarda Romero Vasquez, both in their late teens or early 20s at the time, to go buy bread and milk. To do so, the two young women had to cross the train tracks that ran next to their very modest house in Patrona, Veracruz, Mexico. On their way home, carrying the plastic bags with bread and milk, they stopped for the oncoming train. As they stood watching wagon after wagon push past them, a couple of young men shouted, "Madre, we're hungry. We haven't eaten in 4 days." The two young women hesitated and then handed up their bags of food. When they got home empty-handed, they thought their mother would be angry. The family has very little money. Instead, Leonila thought and said, "No, you did the right thing." That night, Leonila told us, she could not sleep. Why, she wondered, had she never thought about the hundreds of people on top of the train that goes right past her house? Who were they? Where did they come from? And where were they going? She'd only thought of them as moscas, flies, glued to the train. She resolved that she would not eat if they did not eat. Her daughters thought she was delusional. How can you feed them all? We don't know who they are. What if they're criminals fleeing from justice? She didn't let their objections deter her. She said she'd do it alone. She started with 1 kilo of rice, 1 kilo of beans, and tortillas. Her husband and daughters saw her determination and agreed to help. A spontaneous act of kindness turned into a life-changing mission. Now, more than 20 years later, Las Patronas, Leonila, her daughters, and her granddaughters prepare bags of food for 300 to 500 and sometimes more Central American migrants riding La Bestia that passes by their house 3 times a day. There could be many things we could say about this. The brutal nature of the migrant crisis, the terrors of La Bestia, subject of Oscar Martinez's incredible book by that name, the gendered and radical nature of the generosity, the role of faith, the impossibility of the task that the women undertake 3 times a day, 7 days a week, year in and year out, providing food for people they do not know and will never see again. They call themselves women of faith, but they're not nuns and they're not doing church-related or even supported work. Unlike the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo or other women's groups who have spent decades fighting for social justice, these women do not have a personal or political stake motivating their acts. Their actions do not come from a place of struggle. No one in their family has migrated, and they have no theory on immigration policy. They know they will never solve the problem, but they tirelessly exert themselves anyway. How to explain it? Here I gesture towards a reflection, not an explanation, on the empathetic gesture that turns into a life project. So my 2 key terms. Gesture performs not only between bodies, the 2 young women holding out the bags of food to the migrants, but across various expressive arenas. From medieval Latin gestura, gesture is a mode of action. It refers to a movement by the body intended to express thought or feeling, an emotion, an idea, an opinion, and a political posture. The embodied, communicative, affective, and political dimensions of the word open up an expressive field of possibility, which ranges from the empty impulse, if I give a token, or if I make a meaningless gesture, to the small move, my gesture here, or as part of the broader EMC project, to the accomplished acts, Las Patronas giving out food. Gestures can be both fleeting expressions and iterable, quotable enactments that cite previous acts and positions, everything from Brecht's gestus to the hands reaching up the bags towards the train. Gestures often accompany speech, but they are not reducible to verbal language. They capture the many facets and forms of expression that make up the communicative act. Empathy, too, covers a broad range of meanings: spontaneous, neurological, visceral response in human and non-human animals to the predicament of others. Often studies equate empathy with identification, mirroring, and even appropriation, as in their pain becomes my pain. People worry about rampant empathy that we cannot control. Empathy, some say, is manipulated for political reasons. Empathy, studies prove, is innate, but it is easy to override. Young children can be taught not to care or even to hate others. Thinking about empathy in other animals might help us untangle some of these charges against empathy, which have been instrumental in teaching us not to care, to rationalize and justify not caring. The patronas give examples, for example, or on the other hand, of how people constantly try to dissuade them from helping the immigrants. Who are they? What are they to you? It's not your problem. The example of the patronas, however, offers a more hopeful, relational way to think about empathy as part of the spontaneous act of doing something when there is nothing to be done. Leonila says that they have to do what they can, lo que podamos, as she says, which I found very tender. I didn't correct it. It's not about identification or compassion. They are not us. She is not mirroring them, or feeling their pain. She enjoys stability, family, food, and shelter, extremely modest though it is. For her, the sharing of food creates and humanizes the relationship. The migrants go from being flies to being people. The women never talk about the poor migrants or the unjust system. They do not judge. Nadie sabe cómo viene la gente, they say. We never know who these people are or how they come. The migrants are hungry and they have food. It's that simple. This gesture, I believe, potentializes or mobilizes an ontological and epistemic understanding of presence as co-presence, of subjectivity as participatory and relational, founded on mutual recognition. So I'll make two closing observations. Empathetic gestures are not contagious. Others in town, including the church, have not followed the women's generous example, though some people at times come out to help distribute the food. Two, but they are learnable. For Leonila, it was a choice. She reflected on her daughter's spontaneous act of sharing, a visceral response, and turned that into a lifelong practice, a responsibility. And this is my hope. A gesture, Ricardo Dominguez, who will speak today, writes, makes manifest a set of social relations that extend beyond the performance. At the core of a gesture is the potential of the body or bodies to create new types of agency and social interventions. Ways of doing, responding, accepting responsibility when there is nothing to be done. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, it's a great privilege to be here. Thank you so much for your invitation, Marianne. And I'm really pleased to be here to represent the work of Refugee Hosts, which is an interdisciplinary, collaborative, and participatory research project that focuses on local responses to Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, and in Jordan. When we say refugee host there, on the one hand, we mean people who are hosting refugees, Syrian refugees who come into their communities. But we also, and this is what I'm going to talk about a bit today, we're talking about refugees who are hosts. The levels of historical displacement, especially in Lebanon and Jordan, mean that many people who are hosting refugees come from a long, protracted refugee background. John Berger once wrote that migration meant the undoing of the very meaning of the world. What we're seeing now in the West is a phobic repudiation of that undoing, a panicked shoring up of the nation state, and a violent reattachment to the categories of citizen and refugee, us and the other. But in the communities we've been working with, the talk for a long time has instead been, by necessity, about the other who is like me, or who could have been me. It is less the other, or even hospitality, that is the issue, than an often vexed proximity, a necessary but enforced neighbourliness. What I'm going to do in my time today is just give you two examples of how this is working from our work in Lebanon. And I'm going to use a poem in the first instance and a film in the second instance. No, that's not. There's a slide missing, but that's all right. We'll stick there. The first example is from Badawi, which is a Palestinian refugee camp in northern Lebanon, which was created in 1955. Home to approximately 40,000 established Palestinian refugees, over the years, the camp has created communities and cultures and endured civil war and lawlessness. Since 2011, the people of Badawi have hosted thousands of refugees fleeing the war in Syria. In his extraordinary sequence of poems, the Badawi-born poet, and I'm privileged to say my collaborator, Yusuf Mohammed Kassimeh, has taken this crowdedness, this density, this newness, and turned it into a means of talking about how the almost invisible and unremarked work of history, memory, and community gets done when people are suddenly and violently pushed together. Quote, refugees ask other refugees, who are we to come to you, and who are you to come to us? Nobody answers, reads a line in a poem from the sequence, Writing the Camp, or Vis-a-vis, or the Camp. Yusuf's are poems as dense as Badawi itself. Badawi can only grow upwards every time I visit. You've built another layer of habitation. Obviously, it can't grow out. The poems are as dense as Badawi itself, but they are also poems that move through a plurality. Palestinians, quote, Palestinians, Syrians, Iraqis, Kurds share the camp, the same different camp, the camp of a camp, the poem continues. Writing out of her own refugee history, Hannah Arendt said, who are you is the question we address when we speak or act in the world. Who are you? The answer to that question, however, she added, invariably remains hidden from ourselves. We never know who we are completely or even at all. So too, for the refugees of Badawi, the question goes unanswered in Yusuf's poem. Quote, who are we and who are you? Nobody answers. But this is not because the question of refugee identity or community is unanswerable. It's certainly not unanswerable. Nobody answers that question for themselves because the history that's being made in Badawi today and the human community at its heart is being inaugurated again and again through the movement of people, so to speak, in the place of a common time. They have all come to originate the beginning with their own hands and feet, says Kassimeh. They have all come to re-originate the beginning with their own hands and feet. That's my first example. My second example is from the Hamra and Vitvet, or Al-Zafir districts of Beirut, which is an area where lots of refugees come to for quite complex reasons, but usually because there's a very large and vibrant trading area, but it's also an area of refugee history. And here again, in Hammer in particular, the histories of displacement and resistance, living and being, have long been trodden into the streets. And here again, in Hammer, the meanings of what a community might mean are constantly being felt in the texture and living of everyday life, in resistance to an increasingly difficult political and nation-state politics, and as Nora was pointing out, an increasingly hazardous and impossible humanitarian aid situation. Now, on the walls of the bathroom in the politics department of St. Joseph University, where I visited this May. This is now my favourite feminist critique of the nation state. I was sitting there thinking, so she's added to the traditional plea of ways in which we might deal with our human waste. Laissez des tapes naissant dans la toilette où vous l'avez trouvé, leave the nation state in the toilets where you found it. It was at a workshop at St. Joseph's this spring that I met a young woman called Mara Abu Khalil. Khalil left Syria halfway through her English literature degree when she was 19 years old and has lived in Hamra and Vidvet since that time. She's made a community, she made a film, and she has made a community, but she's made a film about the community she lives in, which I'm going to show you in a moment. And she's also just had her first major exhibition in Beirut. She graduated last year from art college. She's 23. Now, the film Mara's made focuses really interestingly on the men in her community. When I first saw this film, I said, Mara, you've made a film about beautiful men. And she just looked the other way. I think she's watching. This is being live streamed. Now, and so that's interesting in itself. Some of the men in the film are refugees, some are longer residents, some are thrown on the charity of others, some are working, many are creating, some are bored, many are sad. Khalil made the film, she said, because she wanted to mark a pause, a time in the timeline of now. And this is what she does, I think, creating a delicate transience as much as by what the film does not do as by what it does. And as you'll see, the silences, time lapses, and running scenes in reverse all demand a certain quality and stillness of attention. From another moment in refugee history, writing from one of the few available chairs in Ain Sabi refugee camp in 1941, the philosopher Simone Weil wrote to her priest friend, she wrote, and I quote, "Love of neighbour is simply this one question, what are you going through?" Love of neighbour is simply this one question, what are you going through? Khalil turns this question into a thing of small beauty, a living thing in itself, as she says, of her life in Beirut. Two questions, then, that Yusuf Casimir and Mara Abu Khalil are asking of their communities. Who are you, and what are you going through? In other words, just because you might want to leave the nation-state or one version of the nation-state in the toilet doesn't mean that new forms of ethical and political community are not possible. Badawi and Hamra are places where people work at all levels to create and sustain the non-nation-state sovereignties necessary for people to live together. This is hardly utopian living. It is necessary survival living. But we've been accustomed to thinking that only a demos shored up between the borders can protect political institutions such as democracy. These transnational communities suggest that the undoing, to go back to Berger's quote, the undoing of the meaning of the world might have other possibilities. I'm just going to show a quick clip from Mara's film.
Lots of men, lots of women, lots of child. But I got also another favorite hours. It's sometimes when I come earlier, like at 3 or 4, lots of people also in the street.
ايه رواق ايه بكتئب شوي احيانا لانه ما بصير الشيء مثل ما بدي، بحب كل شيء يصير مثل ما بدي.
الشمس هيك طالعة ومثلا بس هيك بعمل بايك رايد، باخد بسكليت بسرد على البسكليت شي 3-4 ساعات، انه بلف وين انه ما بعمل بلان، هيك بس بلف بالمدينة كلها. بهيدا النهار بشوفه حلو، كل شي يبقى حلو، انه الشمس حلوة، البنايات حلوين، الطرقات حلوين، السيارات حلوين، كل شي حلو. بس هيدا هيك النهار مش على طول بيجي.
هو الأكسجين تبعي بلبنان، هدول العالم. وبصراحة يعني أنا محظوظ كتير بالعالم اللي حوالي، وإذا كنت مهضوم هن سبب باباتي، وإذا كنت سئيل هن سبب سعادتي، وإذا كنت جدي هن سبب هيك يعني مع حياتي معلقة فيهم.
اليوم مرابح ما بدك. بيجي واحد من هولندا من امريكا بقول لك ليه؟ بقول لك انه احنا بهولندا وبالسويد زهقانين لانه الحياة ناجزة عنا، انه كل شيء خالص، ما في صراع، مؤسسات مستقرة، سياسة جيدة، كل العالم معها مصاري، ما عندنا مشاكل بالريسورسز، ما عندنا مشاكل بأي شيء، بس انه رواق. بس هذا الرواق هو بالنسبة له ملل.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm both honored and very heartened to be in your company today, so thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to be briefly evoking how experimental documentary from a very different position from the one that you showed us, Lyndsey, can bear witness to stateless lives and participate in activist projects while inviting us to think about what it means to be, for someone to be seen and to be heard in traditional conceptions of political being and belonging. So I'm just going to ask you to read some images with me in the next 10 minutes. Blue Sky from Pain is a short experimental documentary film made in 2016 by photographer Stefanos Mangriotis and geographer Laurence Pillon. And it's part of a multimedia archaeology of the border between Turkey and Greece that, in their words, seeks to, quote, preserve and document the memory and traces of sites slated to disappear. Drawing from testimonies by migrants formerly detained on the Greek islands, the film also makes visible and audible unexpected forms of persistence, if not resistance, from within detention. For 15 minutes, images of abandoned detention camps unfold before our eyes while in Syrian Arabic, an anonymous male voiceover narrates his detention. He's detained, he doesn't know why, he doesn't know for how long, there's no cell phone communication for at least 8 months. So what's interesting is that Blue Sky from Pain does not represent humans in detention. Instead, it shows us the things that are left in the wake of human passage. So we have static shots that linger on things that are charged with an eerie kind of animacy, like the flutter of rags at a window, the trickle of a water spigot left on, or dusty, outgrown shoes that evoke flight and capture at the same time. Now, so these shots do not frame or deliver the refugee's body to the viewer. Instead, they're giving us an architecture of detention in ruins, and in doing so, I think, signaling the obsolescence of detention in the face of human movement. The film is also an archive of human traces. Inscriptions on the walls of these camps in Greek, Arabic, and French attest to different temporalities of detention, different populations detained, while the voiceover wonders what other illegalized groups of people were held in these walls before him. And what's interesting is that by contrast to the still shots on camp ruins, slow tracking shots actually animate the graffiti, the tally marks and drawings left behind on these walls, and infuse life and movement into these written traces. Attesting to the memories and dreams and subjectivities of the detained, these writings on anonymous walls bear witness to shadow practices of persistence and even of emergence within spaces of captivity. But no, this is not like some kind of a triumph of the human spirit over the conditions of detention kind of film. No, at the film's midpoint, the voiceover recounts how the camp detainees collectively composed a letter in English for the authorities. And I'm going to play that for you.
So now at the end, we think that a man cannot live without the sunlight. If possible, let us see the sunlight every day for 2 or 3 hours and even breathe the outside air.
بس ما حدا رد علينا.
So, in the letter, sheer biological survival, or what man cannot live without, is invoked in a plea for elementary rights, a plea that remains unheard. The letter goes unanswered. The X-ray you've just seen in the slow tracking shot is most probably checking for tuberculosis, which is a routine test for illegalized migrants detained at the Greek border. But of course, the risks of tuberculosis exponentially increase under the squalid conditions of detention, and this especially among children. So when one is, in fact, deprived of the right to see the sunlight or breathe the outside air. So the montage is actually showing us the complicity between humanitarian care and securitarian hygiene. The medical gaze intrudes into the bones of the illegalized body to regulate a contagion that detention actively produces. The border's immunitary violence, its production of illegal and diseased bodies requiring scanning and quarantine, is here made visible and even palpable. So as I mentioned, the spaces of Blue Sky from Pain are void of humans, but this is until the last couple of minutes where suddenly we see young bodies that surge into view as we hear cries of revolt. Doesn't seem to be playing.
صح الكيل ما عدنا نتحمل. قلبنا تخوت وكسرنا مغاسل الحمامات. بلشنا نصيح ونضرب على الابواب على اضبان الحديد تبع الشبابيك. كان في ناس عم تصيح فريدوم فريدوم. انا كنت جاني. كل العالم كانت جاني. كان في واحد افغاني ولد صغير عمره شي 12 او 13 سنه يمكن. كان لحاله. اخذ شراشفه وولع فيه النار. كان عم يصيح مثل المجنون.
So the film is concluding with video footage from a rebellion in 2009 at the Pagani detention camp in Lesbos. And it was taken by a 15-year-old detainee whose name is Najil Meherdil on an iPhone that was smuggled in by the No Border Network. Other footage of this riot online shows little girls holding up a banner saying, "We want freedom, we don't want food," denouncing humanitarian alibis for detention as protection and care. In 2009, when this footage was taken, Pagani was a closed camp for refugees arriving by boat from Turkey. Even though it was designed for 200 people, it sometimes held over 1,000, including many unaccompanied minors. The endangered child is an emblem of vulnerability and victimhood in the rhetoric of human rights and humanitarianism alike. Recall the effect of Alan Kurdi's tragic image in summer of 2015 and how it became a kind of symbol for the refugee crisis. But the minors who erupt into this frame are not asking for compassion or protection. They demand witnessing and intervention through speech, writing, and action, including the destruction of their space of detention. The riot couldn't be further from the collective letter that, in stilted English, pled for access to basic rights such as toilets and mattresses. Here, bathroom sinks are smashed, beds are flipped over, and sheets burned. The French translation of the Arabic highlights the children's rage as a condition of being undone, driven out of themselves by their conditions. I was beside myself, everyone was. He was yelling as if he were mad. But the rage inside was also supported and circulated by networks of outrage on the outside, as I'll suggest. In August 2009, when the riot we see took place, conditions at Pagani were so dire that it was called a Guantanamo in the Aegean and Dante's Inferno by politicians and Greek ministers alike. But even though Amnesty International and MSF had denounced its degrading and inhuman conditions, the camp wasn't shut down by these humanitarian agencies, but by protests such as this one, including a hunger strike by 130 minors who used the only forces of expression that they had, their blocked bodies, to express themselves. Transnational solidarity activists such as the No Borders Network, who smuggled in the iPhone, supported the riot from the outside by reeling messages and news online and by occupying the detention camp's roof with their own bodies. The riot we see strikes me as a powerful example of the energies and alliances that are forged and mobilized by migrants, even from within the subjection of detention. Its remediated appearance at the close of Blue Sky from Pain suggests that abject spaces remains spaces of politics, that is to say, spaces of persistence, resistance, and solidarity. In the final footage, children are not passive objects awaiting the distribution of shelter, care, or rights, but subjects who are clamoring to be seen and heard from within the juridical erasure that detention is. They surge into the frame of an extended iPhone video camera and construct a fragile space of appearance from which to claim the right to have rights. Artistic testimonies like this one offer bracing alternatives to the depoliticizing rhetoric of the refugee crisis. Blue Sky from Pain does not only try to offer visual or symbolic support to illegalized minors at Europe's outer borders by bringing the unseen into visibility or the unheard into audibility. Its form puts pressure on our very frames for imagining the subject of human rights and the object of humanitarian compassion. It reminds us that spaces of detention are not closed off out there, but connected to the outside and its publics, as if by a Mobius strip. A one-sided continuous surface that, due to its twist, appears to have two sides, the Mobius traverses and destabilizes what is considered the inside and the outside. By conveying the unmappable and, of course, always reversible points at which graffiti on a cell wall can attest to the camp's future ruins, or at which vulnerability can twist into resistance, the Mobius might help us better discern how even detention can be traversed and contested by forms of persistence, solidarity, and militancy. Thanks.
A few years back, I was listening to one of my mentors, Jesuit priest Daniel Berrigan, and he was asked a question. You know, it was during the time of the Gulf Wars and multiple atrocities across the globe. And he basically was asked, you know, what do you mourn most? And without batting an eye, he basically said, the demise of imagination. I was perplexed by his answer. But I do believe that we need to exercise that muscle of our soul so that we can do what we must do in this time. So back in 2007, we began organizing what has become the second wave of sanctuary. I had the honor of being one with some of the families at the national level of co-founding what has become this movement, new sanctuary movement. So with Trump in power, we have about 40 families across the nation living inside temples, churches. We see these spaces as platforms where people decry the injustice that is taking place against their families, against their communities. And the challenge is not only unheeded on the governmental powers, but it is also a claim and the decrying of an injustice which has been also perpetrated by our religious institutions. So it has become a challenge for our religious institutions that find most of them in complicity with what's going on, with the status quo. So here in the city, we have 3 families living in sanctuary. Daniela and Dulce, you can see kind of them recreating the space of the chapel in Holyrood. And I want to introduce you to them. Oh, David is there also, by the way, the little one, David. The mother is from Guatemala. She has been living in the States for about 14 years. She fled the violence of the Zetas that were basically recruiting her family in Guatemala and making them be part of narco trafficking and a lot of criminal activity that plagues Guatemala. So she fled, came to the States, went to Long Island, married, has 3 kids. And because when she crossed, she was not explained that she had to present herself to court. She never did, and she was deported in absentia back in 2005. After getting caught in a traffic violation, she was put again into the monitoring system, which is like parole. So she had to check in periodically at Federal Plaza. And one of those days, back in July 2017, she was basically, she was told to come back in August because she had to turn herself in and she had to go back to Guatemala. So instead of doing that, she went into Holyrood Episcopal Church in Washington Heights. And she's been living there since August 17th. Can you roll that, please?
There was a girl named Dulce. She had a mom who was going to get deported because of Mr. Trump. He doesn't want people who don't have papers for the United States. So on August 17, the mom was going to go to New York City to go to the court, but she didn't go because she knew she was going to get sent to Guatemala. So she decided to go to her church with her 3 kids named Dulce, Daniela, and David. The oldest one, that was Dulce, knew a little bit more about what was going on, but the younger ones didn't really know that much. But actually, the youngest one is 3, that is David, and the medium one is 8, and that's Daniela. So the medium one did know a little bit. When they got there, they were kind of scared and surprised that the church was kind of big and looked kind of scary. The ladies that worked there showed them the room that they were going to stay in. They were happy, but when it was time, their dad left. The oldest one started to cry because she was going to miss her dad, because she gets emotional easy and because she was sensitive. She cried a lot, but the ladies in the church told her not to cry. She was going to be fine, so she calmed down. She was super sad. When they were sleeping there, the kids were kind of scared, but mostly the oldest one because she really missed her dad. She wished she was back home. Now they are there for 6 months, and the oldest girls go to school, and the baby stays home with his mom. The oldest one likes writing and reading and being with her friends.
Diggy diamond, step right in. Diggy diggy diamond, step right out.
After they come from school, they say hi to their mom and go to this program called Washington Heights Choir School. In that program, they eat a little snack and sometimes go singing or do their homework. But if they don't have homework, they do projects. On Tuesday, there's a teacher who comes and plays the recorder and some other instruments. After the program, they eat while watching their tablets. Then they go to take a shower, read a book, or watch the tablet. Then they go to sleep.
George is playing with Dino Raw in the garden. Don't play too roughly with Dino Raw, George. He has moving parts and might get broken.
Now there was 3 birthdays in the church. The first birthday was Dulce's birthday. Dulce thought they would not do nothing for her birthday because her mom couldn't buy anything for her because she can't get out of the church. So her mom brought her downstairs into her room and people sang happy birthday, cut the cake. Kids got goodie bags, played games, and ate. The second birthday was the mom's birthday. And the third birthday was David's birthday. There was balloons, piñatas. They put candy in the piñata. There was also face masks with sticks of Mickey Mouse and cake. Listening to music, eating food, and also eating a lot of candy. David's birthday was really fun. Dulce thinks that her mom is going to get papers for the United States because what Trump is doing is not fair, deporting people who don't have their papers like Dulce's mom. Dulce really wants her mom to get the papers because she still doesn't want to be stuck in the church. If her mom gets her papers, Dulce wants to travel everywhere. She wants to travel to Florida to go to Disneyland, and she wants more places to go to.
Lelo, lai. Canta mi pueblo, canta mi gente, canta en enero, canta en diciembre, canta mi pueblo, canta mi gente, son boriqueños.
How do we make room to hear these voices? That's one of the haunting questions for us. How do we allow those voices to be visible, those faces to be visible? We have, and this is not only Trump, but we have beefed up a homeland security apparatus, injecting millions, thousands of millions of dollars. that basically frames immigrants as threats to national security. Once you put that label, this beast apparatus gets unleashed upon people. And then we get into dynamics of justifying the budgets, which is hyper-militarized, and policies and practices that have been in place for many years. The dynamic underneath this system is one of dehumanizing at all levels. So once we hear immigrants, we think of aliens, we think of A numbers, we think of entities that do not have a history, do not have a name. The system is in place. And Trump has uncovered that system of terror, which is well established. So how do we organize so that people like Aura, another one who is in sanctuary on 86 in Amsterdam, in St. Paul and St. Matthew. No, this is one in the Universalist Church, 87, in West, on the west side, West End. How do we organize so that people, because basically people are living right now in prison. They cannot go out. They cannot lead normal lives. But they have reached such despair that the only option is this violent one, to break away with any kind of normalcy and to get kind of locked up in church, in a temple. Then another set of dynamics get unleashed once the person is in the community, in the faith community, and people can tell you, Tina can tell you, who organizes with us in the Upper West Side. The political and the religious, all those lines get blurred because then you have a community that mobilizes around a person, mobilizes for the well-being of that person. Like in Amanda's case, we realize that it takes about 95 of us volunteers to take care of the kids, to take them to school, to make sure that they lead some kind of normal life. I want to finish with this. What can I say when kids ask me, and we just came back from El Paso trying to reunify family because we have about 3 million to 7 million children, U.S. children, who live in the anxiety of not seeing their parents when they come back from school. So we went down because when we hear about family separation, those children who are U.S. citizens are not included. So how do we expand the conversation, the dialogue, our compassion, our love to protect those children? And here in New York, when a father or a mother abandons his or her child, it's a crime. Isn't it a crime when the government orphans our children? Thank you.
Can I get Mike? Is it on now? Okay, thank you. I just moved my chair so I could see the panelists. Thank you all so much for these incredibly moving and inspiring and thought-provoking presentations. I'm going to make a few remarks and invite the speakers to respond any way they wish. Meanwhile, if you have a question, you should have a card, and then you can pass it to this side, perhaps pass it to this side, and Professor Lee will collect them, and then we will go to questions. But send them all at once, because we're only going to collect them once. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate all the panelists' attention and focus on the question of the refugees' agency. Now, of course, the theme of our symposium and the question of agency is at the heart of that. But I think with it's especially important in thinking about refugees, because in conventional law and political culture, the figure of the refugee is someone without agency. The refugee is constructed as a victim, as passive, as needy, and as abject. And where agency is imagined, it's often conceived as a negative, that the refugee might be a terrorist. So humanitarian concern, humanitarian actions are a powerful counterweight to that discourse. And it's a counterforce, and I might even say it's a soul force. And in humanitarian discourse, words that have come up in some of your presentations and speaking of what's going on around the world, words that come up often are words like compassion, kindness, caring. And those are important. They are so much more important than cruelty, inhumanity, lack of empathy. But I think what I want to raise is this problem, this tension, especially in the West, the challenge of negotiating what you call the politics and religion, right? And often in the practice of charity, we also have problems of paternalism, the expectation of gratitude, assistance, which can often be turned into social control. And in the United States, our refugee policies are, I think, at the core. If we accept people at all, we have an urge to remake the refugee into a proper liberal subject who is self-sufficient and not a burden. And I thought it was stunning to see the image or the video of the young man who returned from the West because he thought it was boring. Now, all oppressed populations are stereotyped negatively, of course, in various ways. And I think so part of the work of resistance and social movements is to assert the humanity of the oppressed as a foundation for claiming rights, claiming sovereignty as individuals and as collectivities. I think in the case of refugees, we face this challenge, right, navigating between compassion, which is entirely legitimate, I think, and politics, which raises another set of issues. The hunger strike, right, to say we don't want food, we want freedom. This is, I think, a good example of one way that people have faced that tension. So how do we make a leap from acts of kindness to policy and politics that can shift the frame, so that as the anthropologist Didier Fasson said, that we think not of victimhood but of justice. We think not of need but equality and rights. We think not of gratitude but of self-determining. So that's the problem I want to pose to you. I don't have the answer, but it's what I think about a lot in facing the challenge of, right now in this country, the policy of refusal, and how do we combat that in small deeds and in larger politics. So, anybody want to start?
I'll start.
Okay.
I think that we have to think about the whole range, right? I think we have to go from These very, very small acts, which I wouldn't even call kindness or compassion, right? It's just a response to a need, and then that turns into responsibility to the very larger. I think in the last panel, people were talking about this too, right? We need all those options. We need to think about it along the whole entire spectrum. And some people are not in a position to think about rights, or changing the system. That's not even kind of conceivable for them from where they're located. So I think it's on every level of those interactions that this potential for doing something presents itself.
There is, I was meeting with this group that we just came back from the border, as I just fleetingly mentioned. And this enormous need of people to be listened to. I've been involved in the world of nonprofit NGOs and the like, and church and the like. And, there are not that many spaces. And you want to be radical and you want to politicize, really listen to people. It is an act of compassion, but I think nowadays it is a political act to let common folk speak their mind. This is about their agency. Amanda, the one who came into Sanctuary after almost 40 years in New York City, we didn't have anybody in Sanctuary. And she came in and she didn't know what the heck she was doing. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. None of us were. But I saw that right after she was in church and how she was embraced, not only by the community, but by the whole neighborhood. It radically transformed everybody. And she began to find her voice in the midst of all that chaos, because it was messy, it was, unplanned. There was a lot of pain in there. There is a lot of pain in there. And last night, part of these reunification campaigns that we are doing is we are finding out that once we open the door, we are like opening this humanity that, it's humanity. There is so much pain, unheard pain, undealt with for many years, trauma for many, many years. So it's very intense, but it has the power to change you. So you want to be radical? Listen to the other.
Yeah. No, I was thinking very much the same as you, particularly at the end of Debarati's paper when you had that beautiful image of the Amoeba strip and transforming vulnerability into resistance. And I thought, well, that's it, isn't it? It's how that kind of ethics of compassion, or that kind of discourse of humanitarianism moving in to a politics of resistance, which is captured so beautifully by your image. But I also think with you, Diane, it's trying to find a language for solidarity that is both political but outside of a dominant discourse and history of humanitarianism. And one of the things when you think about refugee to refugee humanitarianism, yes, it might be sympathy and compassion. Quite often it's political solidarities between different generations or different of Palestinian in particular. So in Badawi, a lot of Palestinians came from Yarmouk when Yarmouk was raised straight in to Badawi. Quite often it's faith. Quite often you'll get people who say, well, I don't like these people, I don't like refugees, but I have to. This is the deal, this is what I'm doing. So it's actually divesting itself of a kind of language with those hierarchies. But it's also, I think, looking at places and images, and this is why I think the arts are so important, film's so important, poetry, where we can forge identifications that aren't based on that kind of language. So one of Yusuf Casimir's images for this it's not an image, it's a reality. When you walk into Badawi, and like most camps, you just sort of disappear in between two buildings. There's an alleyway. There's nothing saying the camp because it's urban. You step in, and the first thing you see is the cemetery. And Yusuf's written a lot about the cemetery. There used to be one cemetery in Badawi, and since the Syrian war, there are now 5. I mean, that's how many you had to build. And one of the first gravestones you see there is the gravestone that reads the person's name, born Haifa, 1948, Palestinian from Yarmouk, died Badawi, 2016. And you look at that image of a sort of shared identificatory history. And Yusuf's point is always, I mean, the thing about the graveyard is it's the one place where you can see the light in the camp because the buildings are so up, so you get this is quite unusual. But there's a kind of, the place of death is where everyone comes together. That is a form of identification, without necessarily a kind of pathos or, and ditto, other people have written about, Itamar Mann has written in the same vein about the sea, those kind of encounters we have in the graveyards where we are, the living graveyard, the floating graveyards, can forge a different kind of aesthetics. I'm loath to say ethics, because I always want to run ethics into politics as quickly as possible, but what my work with this project's teaching me is we need to pause there maybe a bit, is finding a different language.
I really appreciated your, bringing up the kind of tension between, well, you were talking about politics and religion, and the sort of asymmetries, the potential asymmetries of the kind of compassion that humanitarian approaches mobilize in Fassin's account, and the more like perhaps the idealized reciprocities of rights. But and I was wondering, listening to you and just now talking about, I mean, what you're talking about is a kind of deep listening that transforms you, which is, what we were hearing at the earlier panel, transforming and being transformed. And it seems as though, and which is precisely what you're evoking in your example of the cemetery. And, as a complete, as the opposite of that kind of deep listening to be transformed is for instance, the asylum process, where I sometimes volunteer with asylum seekers, and the kinds of formats through which they're incredibly painful experience. Like, how do you listen to pain without immediately bringing in, importing literally categories of PTSD, right? That completely structure the story in a particular way. Necessary, of course, it would seem. But then there's that whole aspect of genuine care in difference and alterity that gets left out. So the entire therapeutic process can fall out in the juridical handling of an asylum case. So, yeah. And so actually I was really interested in the process that you were evoking, from which, people on La Bestia, go from being moscas to kin, because it seems as though what happens is that the interpolation is "Mother, I'm hungry," right? And that's what seems to be triggering that. And I wondered if you could maybe break it down a little bit more, like what you think happened in that kind of process from, they're moving through the space, then we have nothing to do with them, to we are now responsible to feed them. There's something that has to do with the interpolation as mother that I thought was interesting, and I wondered if there's anything to say about the kind of vexed proximity that you're bringing up in relation to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I just kind of gestured towards the gendered nature of this, right? And mother, I mean, these are young women, right, that they're talking to. And in the video, if I'd been able to show you the longer clip of the video, the migrants on the bus, on the train, are picking up they're grabbing the bags of food, and they say, "Gracias, madre," right? And so, I mean, in Latin America, the whole thing with mothers is very The good mother, the good woman is the mother, right? And so there's this kind of sign of respect. You have nothing to fear from me because I'm calling you madre, which is, complicated and all that. And it was interesting because the person who feels that responsibility, I guess that's what I was so interested in was, so you have the spontaneous act of giving the food, but it was the real mother, right, Leonila, who hadn't heard that plea, who was the one who decided that she had to take this upon herself, right? So it wasn't the response. I mean, there was something that she'd learned from that response that gave her this other thing. And I've never, in all my work with people who are doing struggles in Latin America, I've never come across a movement that's lasted 20 years where there was no personal investment in it. And that's what I couldn't understand about it. 20 years of preparing, I mean, it's incredible. If you can watch the videos at some other point, massive amount of food that they cook 3 times a day. They run out to the train, they come back, and they start again. I mean, we're talking things like this of food. It's like unbelievable. And where they get it from, where do they get the money for it? It's just the most remarkable thing. And I'm thinking, well, there's something there that maybe we can learn from. And I guess what I've been able to get it down to is just that step. The mother, I think, is just that sign of, as you say, kin, relationality, that for Leonila, they become human. That's, I don't know, it's very...
If I can jump in also, that's interesting because I really appreciate your point about listening and deep listening. And here we have a case of an ongoing gesture where they don't hear, right? It's the voice is silent. And I'm also, I'm sorry, the point you made about asylum is an interesting case, I think, of not only listening, but how can one control one's own voice, right? Because to get asylum, you have to narrate your story, you have to relive your trauma, otherwise you won't get in. So you have to narrate it in a kind of almost a scripted way. And then once you get in, nobody wants to hear it anymore, right? We want you to get over it right away. So I think this question of, how can asylum seekers and refugees own their own voices, and as well as have us listen to them. Okay, I'm going to go to the questions because in some ways they continue this line of conversation. So the first one, the first two I think I'll read together because they're a little bit related. The term crisis dominates the discourse about refugees and migrants. Is there a crisis? How else can we think about this more productively? And second, how can the United Nations or other bodies help prevent the creation of refugees, wars, criminal activity, etc.? Few people choose to leave their homes, countries, if life is sustainable. So maybe I'll throw these two out to our panel.
I'll throw in because I'm doing this. But, I think maybe we could talk about, the production of refugees instead of the refugee crisis. I mean, there's been a lot of interesting work about how crisis is this, it's not just pitifully inadequate, but it's actually falsifying, right? I mean, there's a historicity to it. There's a way in which we're in a time of, all of a sudden we're in a time of emergency. The crisis, it's like they're the problem. It's a crisis to be managed and to be resolved.
It's a crisis for us.
It's a crisis for us,
West,
right? Yeah.
Took the words right out of my mouth. It isn't it is a crisis for the West. For the West, it's a crisis of the meanings of citizenship and nationality. In terms of is a historical crisis, no. 86%, I think, of refugees are in global South countries. So the crisis is, so absolutely on that. And we really do need to kind of work harder, I think, to resist that language, partly because the solutions, I mean, most times I've sat in meetings saying we must find a solution to the refugee crisis, and you want to say, yeah, well, the solution's going back to this question of nationalism, citizenship, walls, and agency. Maybe that's the solution. I mean, the two models we've had in Europe at the moment, which were serious suggestions, these two Oxford academics came up with this idea of refugia, that they would build little refugee states sort of franchised out as in they said, as in negotiation with the global south. So we pay you and you could set up a little enclave and then refugees can be autonomous and have their own economic zones and it would be wonderful. And I was sitting there listening to this thinking, this is seriously insane. I mean, as well as the politics of being seriously seriously bad. But there are people who've got grants and things to think this. So the crisis is actually pathological and
I bet they want a wall around that border.
Oh yeah, because the refugees would like to feel safe. Yeah, sure. I mean, so that language of management, economic zones, refugeeer, is. I mean, that kind of crisis management has serious implications for people who are people on the move. But more and more, I think, just pushing back on the crisis, and a lot of other countries have been hosting refugees under much more difficult circumstances for a long, long time.
So how do we get to preventing the creation of refugees? This seems to be one of the most intractable problems in our world today. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, in Latin America, for example, the huge number of migrants and refugees, the people dying on those trails and the conditions under which people live are just a direct a result of US policy in Latin America, starting with the intervention and the wars in Central America in the 70s, with the emptying of prisons in the US after the, quote, riots in LA, the Rodney King ones, where the US just sends all of these kids who'd grown up in the US, who were part of gang members who were in jails, back into Central America where they'd never been, and created those gangs, back to all the interventions in which the agro-business and mining business and all of these businesses are taking the land, the water, the resources, and people have nothing to live on. I mean, it's a direct result. Right? So how can people live? Well, if we don't want people trying to find life someplace else, we're going to have to stop intervening in their environments, right? I mean, it just seems like, in that case, a very clear result. And now with the environmental devastation that's going on and the climate change, it's only going to get worse, right? So. Right. It's going to still be their fault, these people who get on the train or risk their lives to get out of there. It's very troubling.
Okay, I'm going to turn for our last round to some local concerns. First, what can we do about the ICE checkpoints? These kind of pop-up checkpoints that ICE conducts. They're happening right here in our neighborhood. So perhaps, what can we do about the ICE checkpoints on nearby streets right here in our neighborhood? Sorry?
Turn the car.
Oh.
The crisis is right in our communities. Young women in Newark go into stores and warn young mothers. Right. Second, what can the city of New York and the state of New York do to better protect vulnerable, undocumented individuals, especially children?
Well, New York claims to be a sanctuary city. And I always say, you scratch that and it bleeds, because last week, grandmother who has been here for 40 years, due to fraudulent act from the lawyer didn't do his work. Basically, she was taken in 3 months ago, and last week she was deported. 6 children, US born, 7 grandchildren, US born, was sent back to Mexico, to a country which she hasn't been there for 40 years. And this is happening in our backyard. So how do we dismantle a system, because it's federal also. The city has these sanctuary rules that No city agency can work with cooperate with the federal government. That's in question also, because sometimes I think there are abuses. For the most part, I think hospitals, schools, and the police do not do that in New York City.
That's right.
Okay?
That's right.
But you just get out, like in Long Island, forget it. I mean, there are checkpoints in Long Island, not Upper West, but Westchester. I mean, just all around us. New Jersey also. A lot of the people that I see being identified is because they've been living here for 10, 20 years. They have families. They have to drive around. They don't have driver's licenses. And they get caught up in that. So that's why I think New Jersey is also asking for driver's licenses. New York, I think, is doing the same. I think we need to push those policies that really protect in a very concrete way our people. We have to remember there are people in our midst. Immigrants have been living here for 30, 40 years, and there is not much relief. There is not a line anymore, okay? And there is this constant incremental attack by the federal government on our communities. So we really need to, join forces with people that are doing the work. New Sanctuary Coalition in the city is doing the work. They have an accompaniment program. They accompany at least 50 of our friends, 50 immigrants, into 26 Federal Plaza. Being present there, even if we don't say much, but being present, it's a way to deter the cruelty, many times the meanness by the officials that feel emboldened by the policies that are being put into practice. Being witnesses with your bodies to that cruelty also has that effect. So just find out how you can get involved, I think. Holding the feet to the fire of our elected officials, I think there is not much accountability on their part. They keep utilizing this friendly rhetoric about immigrants in the city, and they are voting for more money to the police, more money to what's going on here, so we need to question that. The police, the entrenchment of these policies, immigration policies with a hyper militarization and policing of our communities has to be in question also. The broken window policies have to be questioned. Anything that really puts people into the criminal system has to be questioned nowadays, because there is this racism camouflage under these
Legal
policies.
sense, right.
Yeah.
Right. I would just add to that. I think what it means to be a sanctuary city legally is actually fairly limited, although it's very important. Right? It means that the city agencies will not cooperate with Homeland Security or ICE. They will not turn names over. And that we have an alternate form of ID in New York, the New York City ID card, which is valid in the city as a form of ID if people don't have a driver's license or this kind of thing. And I think millions of New Yorkers have now this card. I mean, I have one. So there's so many with the card that it protects those with the card who don't have papers. But also, I think at the grassroots, it's so important. I'm a historian, and the sanctuary movement made me recall what abolitionists did in the North in the 1850s. And in New York City, I mean, there was not only the Underground Railroad helping people get to safer territory, but there were people in New York who fought slave catchers in the street to free slaves from their clutches, right? And we have to be prepared to do that. We have to be prepared to lay our bodies at College Gate if they come for our students. We had to be prepared. And I think there are so many things communities can do. I think I heard a speaker from Judson Memorial that they're trying to create sanctuaries in neighborhoods. So if they can get the store owner or the restaurant owner to put this symbol in their window. You know how our kids know that there's a safe haven they can go if they're in trouble? So there's a sanctuary symbol. So if ICE shows up, people know they can go into that space until it's safe to come out.
That's the symbol.
Right, that's the symbol, right? There's the S inside the, right. So I think, as we need more organizers to get more people to sign up for this kind of thing. We need phone trees in the community so people can be alerted when ICE shows up. So it's extremely important that the city of New York will not cooperate with them, but they come nonetheless. They come nonetheless, and we on the ground, I think, can also thwart them. Okay, I think we're a little bit over time. We need to wrap up. Okay, so thank you for your questions. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Meet and talk about what we can do, please come back at 2:30. Lunches are for sale downstairs.